Hello everyone, and welcome back to our channel. I hope you're having a peaceful and blessed day, wherever you are. Today, I invite you to join me on a very special journey, a story that speaks of faith, resilience, and a quiet miracle. After a devastating earthquake shook a small village in Chile, a simple yet extraordinary event occurred. The statue of the Virgin Mary, standing amidst the ruins, was seen, smiling, a gentle, mysterious smile that would change the lives of everyone who witnessed it. If you enjoy stories of hope, mysteries of faith, and the unseen hand of God moving in our world, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and ring the bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming stories. Now, take a deep breath, open your heart, and let's walk together into the quiet miracle of the Virgin's smile. Chapter 1. The day the earth trembled. I have lived my entire life in Santa Rosalia, a village so small and tucked away in the folds of southern Chile's hills that few maps bother to name it. It was a quiet place, where the days moved slowly. The seasons wove themselves into the rhythms of planting and harvest, and the bells of our old church marked the passing hours with gentle, familiar chimes. Each morning, I would rise to the sound of roosters crowing beyond my shuttered windows, the scent of bread baking in neighbors' ovens wafting through the crisp mountain air. Life here was simple, and perhaps because of that, it felt closer to heaven. We tended to our gardens, raised our children, and bowed our heads before the Almighty with a faith as sturdy as the earth beneath our feet. At the heart of Santa Rosalia stood our parish church, the beating soul of the village. It was a crumbling stone building, weathered by centuries of storms and sun, but still dignified. Ivy climbed its outer walls, hurling like green fingers across the faded gray stones. Inside, the pews creaked under the weight of old prayers, and the wooden crucifix above the altar gazed solemnly down upon us. But it was the statue of the Virgin Mary that drew the most reverence. She stood in a small alcove to the left of the altar, carved from pale marble that had long since lost its youthful luster. Time had mellowed her face into something almost tenderly human. Her cheeks seemed softly rounded, her eyes full of an eternal patience. I had knelt before her many times in my life, whispering prayers for my family, for the village, for my own weary soul. There was something about that statue, something that had always made me feel watched over, not in the way that inspires fear, but in the way a mother watches her sleeping child, with a fierce and silent love. The day everything changed began like any other. It was early autumn, and the morning mist still clung to the hillsides when I left my small home and made my way toward the village square. The earth smelled damp and sweet. The fields that bordered the village were painted in rich golds and deep greens. Somewhere nearby, the river sang its song over smooth stones. I remember stopping at the bakery to greet old Mrs. Alvarez, who handed me a warm loaf with a wink and refused payment. As she often did, I tucked the bread under my arm and strolled toward the church, intending to light a candle and offer a brief prayer before the day's chores began. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of wax and old wood. I genuflected, crossed myself, and made my way to the Virgin's alcove. As I struck a match and lit a candle at her feet, I thought I saw, just for an instant, a flicker of light move across her marble face. Perhaps it was the flame dancing in the drafty air, or perhaps it was something else. I smiled to myself, feeling a curious warmth bloom in my chest. If only I had known. By midday, the sun had broken through the mist, scattering it like torn gauze across a sky so blue it seemed almost unreal. Children played in the dusty streets, chasing a ragged ball. Farmers hauled cartloads of vegetables toward the market. In the square, a young woman sold embroidered shawls, her laughter bright and careless. I was speaking with Father Ignacio, our parish priest, about organizing repairs for the church's crumbling roof when the earth groaned beneath our feet. It was a low, sickening sound, like the growl of something ancient and immense stirring in its sleep. I staggered, clutching the edge of the fountain for balance. Across the square, I saw people stop in confusion, faces turning to one another with silent questions. Then the shaking began. The ground bucked like a living thing. Cobblestones cracked and heaved. The church bells, still and silent for so long, suddenly began to toll wildly, their clamor filling the air with a chaotic, terrifying music. "Get down," Father Ignacio shouted, but his voice was lost beneath the roar. Walls split open, roofs caved in. The bakery I had visited that morning crumbled like a sandcastle under a wave. A scream rose above the din, then was cut off as the steeple of the church shuddered and began to fall. I threw myself to the ground, covering my head with my arms as debris rained from above. Dust filled the air, choking and blinding. Somewhere nearby, I heard the crash of a cart overturning, the frightened whinny of a horse. It felt endless. The shaking seemed to come in waves, each one worse than the last. I pressed my face into the dirt, tasting earth and blood and fear. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the trembling began to subside. Cautiously, I lifted my head. The village I had known all my life was unrecognizable. Buildings lay in ruins. Great fissures split the ground, some wide enough to swallow a man whole. Smoke rose in oily black columns from several fires, staining the sky, and amid it all, an eerie silence fell. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if we were all collectively holding our breath, waiting for the earth to shake us apart once more. I rose shakily to my feet. My legs felt boneless. My hands trembled. "Maria!" Someone screamed. "Help!" I stumbled toward the sound, finding Mrs. Alvarez trapped beneath a fallen beam. With the help of two others, we managed to lift it enough for her to crawl free, her face bloodied but alive. All around me, people staggered through the dust and rubble, calling out names, weeping, praying aloud, "Mother of God, have mercy." I heard a man sob, over and over again, and then someone cried out from the direction of the church, "The Virgin, look at the Virgin." A group of us stumbled toward the broken remains of the church. The roof had collapsed entirely, and part of the bell tower lay strewn across the courtyard. The heavy wooden doors had splintered inward, revealing the shattered interior. But somehow, miraculously, the alcove that housed the statue of the Virgin Mary had survived. She stood there, untouched amid the wreckage, her marble robes unbroken, her face serene. And, Though I tell you this with the full weight of my soul, it seemed to me that she was smiling. It was not a broad grin or a mocking leer. It was a soft, subtle curve of the lips, so slight that I thought at first it must be a trick of the light. But as I drew closer, I saw that others had fallen to their knees, weeping, crossing themselves, reaching out with trembling hands. The Virgin smiled. I dropped to my knees, overcome by a feeling I cannot fully describe. It was as if, for a single, breathless instant, the veil between heaven and earth had lifted, and we were children again, safe in the arms of a mother who loved us beyond words. Around me, the world was broken, but in that brokenness, in that aching, splintered silence, there was a glimmer of something more powerful than the trembling earth. Hope. I bowed my head and wept, not for what we had lost, but for what we had found. Chapter 2. Among the ruins. The first light of dawn crept hesitantly across the shattered landscape of Santa Rosalia. It painted the broken stones and splintered timbers with a pale, ghostly glow, as if the world itself was struggling to believe what had transpired. I awoke on the ground where exhaustion had claimed me the night before. My body aching, my mouth dry with dust. Around me, others stirred as well, neighbors, friends, all of us dazed and silent, our faces streaked with grime and tears. There was a heavy stillness in the air, a silence so profound it pressed against the skin like a second weight. The earth beneath us, once so steady, now felt fragile, like thin glass stretched over an unseen abyss. Slowly, as if pulled by an invisible thread, the survivors began to gather in the square. Those who could walk stumbled through the wreckage, while others carried the injured on makeshift stretchers fashioned from broken doors and blankets. Father Ignacio moved among us like a wounded shepherd, his cassock torn and blood-stained, but his presence steady. He touched shoulders, whispered prayers, and lifted the spirits of those who could not stand on their own. "Come," he said hoarsely, "let us gather together." And so we did. We assembled amid the ruins, clutching one another, seeking some anchor against the tide of fear that threatened to wash us away. The faces around me were pale and hollow-eyed, every smile stolen by the night. I looked toward the church, or what was left of it. The once proud stone walls had crumbled into heaps of rubble. The roof was gone entirely, open to the weeping sky above. The wooden pews were crushed beneath fallen beams. Shattered stained glass glittered like sorrowful jewels across the ground. Yet even amid such devastation, the alcove that had cradled the statue of the Virgin Mary stood, stubborn and intact, like an island in a sea of ruin. She remained there, untouched. Her marble robes were speckled with dust, her outstretched hands dusted with debris. But she had not fallen. She gazed out over the wreckage with that same patient tenderness, as though she had known this would come and had chosen to remain. A murmur rose from the crowd as more eyes turned toward her. "She's still there. It's a miracle. She didn't fall." I moved closer, my heart hammering in my chest. Something about the sight of her, so serene amid chaos, made my throat tighten with emotion. It was then that I heard it. A soft gasp, a cry of wonder. "Look," someone whispered. "She's smiling." I froze. Could it be? Cautiously, I edged nearer. Dust swirled in the weak sunlight, making the air shimmer like a veil. I rubbed my eyes, certain that fatigue and grief were playing tricks on me. But no, others were seeing it too. The corners of her marble lips, were they not turned upward? Ever so slightly, not a grin, not a beam of joy, but the barest whisper of a smile, like the first glow of dawn or the last fading light of evening. A smile born not of happiness, but of profound, aching love. I fell to my knees, overwhelmed. "It cannot be," muttered old Mateo beside me, shaking his head in disbelief. "It's our minds, our fear. It makes us see what we wish for." Perhaps, or perhaps not, the human heart is a fragile thing, easily bruised and easily deceived, but also capable of perceiving truths that lie beyond the grasp of reason. I wanted to believe, I needed to believe. Around me, voices murmured in awe and doubt alike. It's the light playing tricks, or the dust in the air, or maybe she truly smiles. Father Ignacio approached the statue, his steps slow and reverent. He knelt at her feet and bowed his head. "Mother of Mercy," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. "Stay with us." Tears blurred my vision. In that moment, something ancient stirred within me, something deeper than fear, deeper even than sorrow, a knowing, planted long ago in the soil of my soul, now bloomed into a fragile, trembling faith. The Virgin's smile, whether real or imagined, was enough. It was a sign, a lifeline cast into a sea of despair. We were not alone. The day passed in a daze of digging, searching, weeping, and praying. We formed search parties to look for the missing, built crude shelters from salvageable wood and cloth, tended to the wounded as best we could. Everywhere I turned, I saw the same haunted look in people's eyes, but also something else. A flicker of stubborn hope, a tiny flame refusing to be snuffed out. And always, in the corner of my vision, the Virgin stood. When night fell, cold and thick with fear, we lit fires and huddled close for warmth. No one dared sleep inside the ruined houses. The aftershocks came sporadically, each one sending fresh tremors of panic through the survivors. But amid the uncertainty, one ritual emerged. Before night swallowed the village, we gathered around the Virgin's alcove. We lit candles, whatever few we could find, and placed them at her feet. The small flames danced in the chilly breeze, casting long, quivering shadows across her marble face. Again and again, my eyes were drawn to her lips. Was it just my imagination? Had grief so fractured my mind that I saw comfort where none existed? Or had she, our Blessed Mother, chosen this broken place to reveal her presence? I could not say, and perhaps it did not matter. The belief itself was enough to breathe life into weary hearts, to bind fractured spirits together. As I knelt there, hands clasped tightly in prayer, I realized that faith is not always a matter of certainty. Sometimes, it is the choice to believe in spite of uncertainty. Sometimes, it is the decision to see with the heart when the eyes are blinded by fear. That night, as the stars shivered in the black velvet sky, and the fires flickered low, and the ruins of Santa Rosalia lay heavy with the scent of smoke and sorrow, I closed my eyes and whispered a prayer, not for answers, not for miracles, but for the courage to hope. And in the silence that followed, I thought, or perhaps only dreamed, that I heard a voice, soft as the breeze, murmur back, "I am with you." And for the first time since the earth had trembled and shattered the world I knew, I slept, not without fear, but with faith. Chapter 3. Whispers of a Miracle. The days that followed the earthquake moved like shadows at dusk, long, heavy, and slow. Time seemed to have changed its shape, no longer measured in hours or minutes, but in the cries of the morning, the silences of the stunned, and the sound of hammers striking stone as survivors began the painful work of clearing the wreckage. The scent of dust clung to everything. Our hands became blistered from lifting beams and gathering bricks. Our backs ached, our eyes burned, and yet we carried on. But even as we toiled, something else spread through the village, not just sorrow or fatigue, but something lighter, more delicate. It passed from mouth to mouth in hushed voices, like a prayer passed secretly between trembling hands. She smiled, the Virgin. She smiled at us. It started with just a few. I remember the young seamstress, Isabella, barely 20 and recently widowed, who had survived the quake by sheltering beneath her wooden loom. I was sure I would die, she told me one morning, her voice barely above a whisper. But as the beams fell around me, I saw her, in my mind, in my heart, her face. It gave me peace. She smiled. Then old Senor Roberto, a man known more for his cynicism than his piety, confessed to seeing a flicker of light around the statue just before the quake struck. I thought it was a trick of the sun, he said, shaking his head, but now I wonder, maybe she warned us, maybe she was watching. Others followed. An elderly woman claimed her deaf grandson had heard the bells tolling seconds before the shaking began. A boy swore a white dove flew from the church roof just before the steeple collapsed. A farmer spoke of how the ground split around his home but spared the room where his children slept. The stories multiplied, and with them, the whispers. Some called them miracles. Others dismissed them as desperate imaginations, the mind's way of making sense of horror. But even the skeptics fell silent when they passed the Virgin's alcove, now adorned with flowers, rosaries, and the flickering flames of vigil candles. It was not only that she had remained standing, it was not only that her marble form had been untouched while stone and wood and metal around her had shattered. It was her face, her smile, a smile too subtle to sculpt, too alive to be an illusion. Even those who denied it could not help but stare longer than they intended. I, too, found myself drawn back to her again and again. Each time I stood before her, I tried to measure the curve of her lips, the light in her eyes, the tilt of her chin. I found no answers, only the stirring of something wordless inside me. Hope. One afternoon, perhaps 4 days after the quake, Father Ignacio called for a gathering. We stood in what had once been the nave of the church. Now nothing more than a flattened space between broken walls. The Virgin's alcove remained at one end, and we arranged ourselves around it. The priest looked weary. Lines had etched themselves deeper into his face, and his eyes seemed to carry the weight of every soul he had failed to save. But his voice, when he spoke, was clear. My dear brothers and sisters, He began, "We have suffered, we have buried loved ones. We have seen our homes, our church, our lives torn apart, and yet, we are still here." He paused, glancing toward the statue, "And so is she." The wind stirred his tattered robe. Someone coughed. A baby cried softly in the distance. Some say she smiled. He continued, his gaze sweeping across the faces before him. Some say she warned us, protected us, comforted us. I will not stand here and tell you what to believe. Faith cannot be forced. He stepped closer to the Virgin. But I ask you this, when the earth broke beneath our feet, when the sky darkened and death came like a thief, what did you cling to? He let the question hang in the air, heavy as incense. We have no roof, we have no walls, but we have each other. We have our prayers, we have our faith, and maybe, just maybe, we have her smile. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Father Ignacio knelt and began to pray. Hail Mary, full of grace. One by one, voices joined him, soft at first, then stronger. The Latin words rose into the smoky air, weaving together like a thread stitching the village's torn heart. I stood there, hands clasped, lips moving with the rest, and for the first time since the quake, I felt something more than sorrow. I felt connected, not just to my neighbors, but to something greater, something ancient and enduring. That night, as we sat around the fires sharing bread and stories, the talk turned again to the miracles. "I shouldn't be alive," muttered young Tomas, rubbing the back of his neck where a beam had barely missed him. It landed an inch from my head. An inch. "My goat saved me," someone else said with a nervous laugh. "Dragged me out by the sleeve before the barn collapsed." We laughed, for the first time, real laughter, and it sounded strange, like a forgotten song returning to memory. A woman passed around a tattered Bible. We took turns reading aloud, stumbling through the Psalms, the parables, the promises. Each voice, no matter how cracked or soft, felt like a stone placed in the foundation of something new, something holy. And as the firelight danced in the night, I looked again toward the church ruins, where a single candle still flickered before the Virgin. Her face was half lit, half shadowed, mysterious, alive. Whether her smile had ever changed, I could no longer say, but in our hearts, it had become the seed of something we dared not name. A miracle, perhaps, or the whisper of one. And for now, that was enough. Chapter 4. The Smile That Healed. In the fragile days that followed the quake, Santa Rosalia was a wounded village, a place stitched together by broken hearts and trembling hands. Yet amid the ruin, a strange and tender power began to grow. It was not spoken of in grand speeches or written down in bold letters. No banners announced its presence. It moved, instead, like the mist that hugged the hills at dawn, silent, patient, inevitable. Hope. It was born in the soft murmur of prayers whispered at the Virgin's feet. It bloomed in the careful, clumsy rebuilding of fallen homes. It shone in the quiet moments when a hand reached out to steady a neighbor or wipe away a tear. Each day, as the sun rose over the battered village, a small procession would form before the remains of the church. There, before the untouched alcove and the marble figure who had weathered the storm. Villagers knelt in the dirt to pray. Some came with trembling faith, others with desperate longing, and still others with nothing but the raw, hollow ache of grief. But all found something waiting for them. Healing, not the dramatic, storybook kind. No one leapt to their feet cured of blindness or stood tall with bones miraculously mended. It was subtler than that. It was the grandmother who, after burying her only son, found herself able to sing again, her thin voice threading through the twilight like a thread of gold. It was the farmer who had lost everything, land, home, livelihood, yet still found the strength to plant seeds in the battered soil, whispering a prayer with every handful. It was the widow who had wept herself into exhaustion and, kneeling before the Virgin, felt a sudden and overwhelming warmth flood her chest, loosening the knot of despair. And it was the little ones, most of all, the children, who had seen their world torn apart, who had huddled beneath collapsed roofs and cried out for mothers who would never answer. They came to the Virgin and found, somehow, a peace. There was one child whose story touched us all. Her name was Lucia. She was just 6 years old when the earth shattered our village, and she lost her mother to the falling stones of their home. For days after the quake, Lucia wandered the ruins, silent and wide-eyed, clutching a ragged doll to her chest. She spoke to no one. She ate little. She slept curled up in corners, flinching at every aftershock, until the night she dreamed. It was old Maria Elena, the village midwife, who first heard Lucia's tale. She found the girl sitting before the Virgin's alcove at dawn, her tiny hands folded neatly in prayer. "Mama came to me," Lucia said simply. Maria Elena knelt beside her. In a dream, Lucia nodded. Her voice was soft, but clear. "I was cold, I was scared, but then Mama was there. She took my hand. She led me to a lady in white." She pointed to the statue. The lady smiled at me. She picked me up. She held me. She said I would never be alone. Tears filled Maria Elena's eyes. She pulled Lucia into her arms and rocked her gently. The story spread through Santa Rosalia like sunlight chasing away shadows. Some scoffed. Dreams were dreams, after all, but many, most, believed, not because they had seen the dream themselves, but because when they looked at Lucia, they saw the proof. She laughed again, she played again, she braided flowers into her hair and sang nonsense songs in a bright, clear voice. The wound in her tiny soul had not disappeared, but it had been kissed, bandaged, and blessed, and it was healing. More and more, villagers spoke of feeling something when they prayed before the Virgin. A warmth, like the sun pressing through closed eyelids. A scent, faint but sweet, of roses where none grew. A pressure, gentle and reassuring, upon their bowed shoulders. I, too, felt it, one evening, long after the others had returned to their makeshift shelters. I lingered by the statue. The stars blinked coldly overhead, and the wind carried the scent of smoke and ash. I had come burdened with doubt, with anger, with the unspoken question that gnawed at my heart. Why had some been spared and others taken? Why had prayers gone unanswered? I knelt, fists clenched, and stared up at her marble face. "Why?" I whispered. "Why?" No voice answered from the heavens. No visions split the night, only the silence, only the statue. But in that silence, I felt something, a presence, a nearness, a hand I could not see, resting lightly on my bent head. And in that presence, I felt my grief crack open and spill out and be gathered up by hands larger and gentler than my own. I wept, not the bitter, choking sobs of rage and despair, but the clean, freeing tears of one who has been seen and heard and loved. When I rose at last, my legs were stiff, my cheeks wet, but my heart felt lighter. The burden was not gone, but it no longer crushed me. Word of such experiences continued to spread, carried by whispers and by the quiet glow in people's eyes. Visitors from neighboring villages began to arrive, drawn by rumor and longing. They brought offerings, flowers, candles, simple handmade tokens, and left them at the Virgin's feet. They knelt in the dust and prayed. Some found peace, some found tears, some found the courage to face another day. And always, they spoke of her smile, the curve of marble lips that had withstood an earthquake, and that now withstood the storms of the human heart. It was not only the faithful who were touched. Skeptics, too, felt something shift within them. "I don't know what I believe," muttered Arturo, the blacksmith, a gruff man with hands like anvils. "But when I stand before her, I feel not alone." Perhaps that was miracle enough. In the evenings, we gathered around fires and shared stories, not of destruction, but of survival, of the small, fierce triumphs that had carried us through. We sang hymns, our voices thin but determined, rising into the bruised sky. We rebuilt not only our homes but our hearts. And in the center of it all stood the Virgin, silent, still, smiling. Her smile did not erase our pain. It did not undo what had been lost, but it reminded us that even in the deepest sorrow, there could be beauty. Even in brokenness, there could be grace. Even in death, there could be life. Each time I stood before her, I remembered Lucia's words. She said I would never be alone. And somehow, in that battered, blessed place, I believed it. Chapter 5. Voices in the Wind. As the days drifted into weeks, Santa Rosalia took on the quiet rhythm of a place suspended between sorrow and something deeper. Not joy, not yet, but a kind of reverent stillness. It was as though the village itself had begun to hold its breath. Listening. For what? None of us could say. But we all felt it. By now, the tale of the Virgin's smile had traveled far beyond our broken valley. Pilgrims arrived on foot and horseback, dusty and tired, carrying bundles of food and candles in worn packs. They came with rosaries strung around their necks and questions in their eyes. Some wept as soon as they reached the church ruins. Others stood in silence, gazing at the statue as if waiting for it to speak. They brought with them stories from other towns, of visions and strange dreams, of whispered prayers answered in unexpected ways. And slowly, something changed. It began with the scent. A sweet, unmistakable perfume of roses began to drift through the ruins in the evenings. It would come and go like a breath, delicate but undeniable. One moment the air would be heavy with the smell of ash and wet stone, and the next, a bloom of fragrance, full and soft and pure. There were no roses growing nearby. Not a single bush had survived the quake, and yet the scent lingered. "Do you smell it?" someone would whisper, and others would nod, wide-eyed, breathing deeply, as though inhaling a promise. Then came the light. It wasn't the flicker of candles. This light was softer, paler, with no obvious source. Those who camped near the church began reporting a glow around the Virgin's face just before dawn, a faint illumination, like moonlight reflected off snow, radiating from her marble features. Some said it was the light of hope. Others said it was nothing more than the moon catching on dust. But those who had seen it knew better. I heard the murmurs. I watched the visitors press their palms together, tears in their eyes, voices trembling. But still, I hesitated to believe. I had seen the smile. Yes, and I had felt the warmth, the peace, but a light, a perfume. I needed to know for myself. And so, one night, I stayed. I told no one. I simply lingered after the others had gone, pretending to gather the last of the candles. When the fires in the village square had burned low and even the dogs had curled into silence, I returned to the church ruins and knelt before her. The wind was gentle that night, whispering through the broken stones. The moon was high, throwing silver shadows across the rubble. I wrapped myself in a woolen shawl and sat down near the statue, lighting a small candle that barely pushed back the dark. I waited. At first, nothing happened. The hours passed slowly. My legs grew stiff. My back ached. My breath rose in misty tendrils, and the flame of the candle danced in the breeze. But then, the scent came. It arrived like a sigh. One moment, I was alone in the cold night air. The next, a warmth bloomed in my chest, and the unmistakable fragrance of roses surrounded me. Not overpowering, but clean and sweet, like a memory of summer pressed between the pages of a prayer book. I closed my eyes. The wind stirred my hair. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird called, but here, beside her, all was still. Then, the light, it started faintly, so faintly I thought my eyes were playing tricks. The marble face of the Virgin, once cold and pale, began to glow with a soft luster, as though lit from within. Her eyes, carved in stone, seemed to shimmer ever so slightly. I held my breath, not in fear, but in awe. It wasn't bright, it didn't flare or flash. It was gentle, like dawn rising over the hills, like a mother's hand brushing back a fevered brow. In that light, I felt something move inside me, something old and aching and tired. The doubts I had carried for so long, the silent guilt, the anger I had buried beneath my prayers, all of it seemed to rise like mist and dissolve into the air. And then, I heard it, a voice, not out loud, not in the air around me, but in the marrow of my bones, a whisper that did not speak in words, but in presence. You are seen, you are known, you are loved. I fell forward, burying my face in my hands, not from fear, not from shame, but because I had no other response left. In the presence of that kind of peace, language fails, thought fails, only the soul remains, bowed and open. When I looked up again, the light had faded. The scent lingered a moment longer, then vanished on the breeze. But I knew what I had felt, and I knew I had not been alone. In the days that followed, I told no one, not at first. I wasn't ready, not because I feared being mocked, but because I feared diminishing it with words. How do you explain silence that speaks louder than thunder? But slowly, as others began to share their own nighttime experiences, I found myself nodding, listening, understanding. We were not imagining these things. We were being invited into something, a mystery, a miracle. Father Ignacio remained cautious. The church is slow to name such things. He reminded us gently, faith is not built on signs and wonders, but on love. Still, I saw how often he returned to the Virgin's alcove, how he lingered longer than before, how he sometimes pressed his fingers to the cool marble and closed his eyes. Perhaps he, too, had stayed one night. Perhaps he, too, had heard the voice in the wind. Skeptics continued to arrive, some with notebooks and cameras, some with devices meant to measure light, temperature, energy. It could be phosphorescence, one said, or residual heat from the sun, said another. But none could explain the scent, or the way time seemed to fold around that place, or the hush that fell upon them when they stood before her. Even the doubters left different than they came, more quiet, more thoughtful. One man, a professor from Santiago, wrote a letter to our priest before departing. He had spent 3 nights observing the statue, recording data, marking patterns. In the end, he wrote simply, "I came looking for proof. I found peace. That is enough for me." And so the whispers continued, not of fear, not of superstition, but of something tender, elusive, and real. Voices in the wind, carrying prayers, carrying answers, carrying the soft, unwavering promise that even here, among ruin and sorrow, grace could still speak, and we were listening. Chapter 6. The Chapel Reborn. It began with a plank of wood, a single board, salvaged from the wreckage of a fallen home, carried on the shoulders of young Tomas and laid gently beside the Virgin's alcove. He said nothing as he placed it down, only nodded once and turned away, but his gesture echoed. The next day, others brought stones, then nails, then paint. There was no formal announcement, no meeting of elders, no committee formed to decide what should be done. The will to rebuild rose organically, like water returning to a dry streambed. The statue of the Virgin, untouched and radiant, had become more than a remnant of survival. She had become our center. So we built around her, not a grand cathedral, not a towering church of wealth and power, but a chapel, a small, wooden, sun-warmed chapel, built by our hands, shaped by grief and gratitude. Its walls were humble and slightly uneven, its roof patched with old shingles and new ones, its windows clear glass that caught the sunlight and poured it onto the altar like a silent blessing. But it was beautiful, because it was ours. Each piece of it held a story. The beams were carved from trees planted by our grandparents. The altar was made from a table rescued from the ruins of the village school. The candle holders were fashioned from melted scraps of iron collected from the blacksmith's destroyed shop. Children painted icons with trembling fingers. Mothers wove simple linens for the altar cloths. The elderly, too frail to lift or hammer, sat in the shade and prayed for those who worked. And every day, Before we picked up our tools, we stood before her, our virgin, our silent guardian, and asked for strength. She gave it, in the heat of the afternoon sun, in the ache of tired muscles, in the quiet unity of people who had suffered together and now dared to dream again. She gave it. Word of our rebuilding spread, first to nearby villages, then to towns further away. They came on foot, by donkey, by bus when the roads allowed. Some brought food, some brought candles, some brought tears. They came not to marvel at architecture, but to kneel before a statue that had, according to our whispers, smiled in the darkest hour. Pilgrims, wanderers, the curious and the faithful. They came carrying burdens, and they left a little lighter. And so, on a clear morning just shy of the quake's third month, we gathered to consecrate the chapel. The sky was brilliant blue, brushed with clouds like cotton drifting in the sun. Birds sang in the trees, and a breeze carried the scent of pine and ash. We had no bishop, no archdiocese approval, but we had Father Ignacio, whose hands shook slightly as he held the chalice, whose voice cracked as he led the Mass. We had a choir of villagers whose harmonies rose like incense, imperfect and heartfelt. We had candles, dozens of them, flickering in the soft light. And we had her, the Virgin, dressed now in a robe sewn from fine cloth donated by a woman who had lost her entire family. A crown of dried flowers rested on her head. Her smile, that subtle, gentle curve, remained unchanged. The Mass was short, but no less sacred for its brevity. There was the Gospel, read by Lucia, the little girl whose dream had started so many hearts beating again. Her voice was small but sure. There was the Eucharist, passed from hand to hand with reverence. There was silence, long and unbroken, as we stood together and let our hearts speak where words failed. And there was singing, not grand hymns, but the songs of our childhood, the lullabies our mothers had sung, the melodies that had cradled our faith when it was new and unsure. We were one body, not just as villagers, but as people who had suffered and hoped and found something holy in the wreckage. After the final blessing, no one rushed to leave. We lingered. Some knelt in prayer, some embraced, some simply stood and stared at the sunlight slanting through the glass, painting the Virgin in gold. And the wind, which had so often carried cries and prayers, now carried something softer, laughter, children laughing. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, they ran outside the chapel without fear, chasing one another through the grass, their giggles rising like a hymn. We began to live differently, not just because of what we had lost, but because of what we had discovered. We shared more freely. We forgave more quickly. We listened. Neighbors who had once passed each other in silence now sat on steps together. Hands clasped, stories exchanged. We planted gardens in the ashes. We wrote the names of the lost on stones and laid them at the foot of the chapel, not as grave markers, but as seeds of remembrance. The chapel stood at the village's center like a heartbeat, quiet but constant. Morning prayers were joined by evening songs. Visitors came and went, leaving tokens and tales, and we remained, holding fast to the quiet miracle that had not shouted, but whispered. A smile. That was all it had taken. A smile, to remind us that heaven touches earth in the smallest of gestures, that the sacred is not always thunder and lightning, but sometimes a single marble face unchanged while the world falls down. Sometimes a chapel can rise not from blueprints, but from brokenness, and sometimes love is most visible in the hands that rebuild, the voices that sing through sorrow, the people who choose to believe again. The chapel was reborn, and so were we. Chapter 7. Pilgrims of the Heart. Time, like the wind that rolls over these hills, has not ceased its passing. Seasons have changed, crops have grown and faded, children have become parents, and I have grown old. My hands are knotted and slow now. My steps falter more often than not. My voice, once strong enough to read at Mass, is now a hushed rasp, like dry leaves brushing stone. But still, each morning, I rise before the sun and make my way to the chapel. The path is well worn, though the grass has crept in at the edges. My cane taps softly against the stones, and sometimes a bird flits across my path. Startled by my presence, I smile at them. We are both, in our own ways, creatures of habit. The chapel stands as it always has, small, wooden, simple, but time has not left it untouched. Ivy curls around the posts. The roof has been repaired more than once. The paint has faded to a gentle softness, like something seen through memory. But the Virgin still smiles. I see her as I open the door, the soft creak of the hinges greeting the dawn. Light filters through the windows, painting her face in gold and blue. Flowers, fresh or dried, always wait at her feet. Candles flicker low, their smoke curling upward like whispered prayers. I take my place on the nearest bench and bow my head. I do not speak much in these prayers. I have said enough in my lifetime. Now I simply sit and breathe and let the silence carry me. Some days I am joined by others, a mother with her baby, an old friend who has outlived her children, a teenager who comes in quietly and leaves before the hour strikes. And sometimes I am alone, but never truly, because always there is her, the Virgin, the heart of our chapel, the still point in a world that continues to spin too fast. The story of her smile is now legend. Children learn it before they can write their names. They act it out in small plays during feast days, dressing up in robes too large and voices too loud. But with hearts sincere, they know about the earthquake, about the ruins, about the light, the scent, the healing. They know about Lucia's dream, and the professor who found peace, and the chapel that rose from ash. They know because we tell them, because stories, like prayers, are meant to be passed on. The miracle, they say, was the statue that survived when all else fell, the smile that appeared when all hope was lost, the way light danced on marble and roses bloomed in barren places. But I know the true miracle. It was not the stone that remained unbroken. It was us, our hearts, cracked and raw and trembling, and yet capable of healing, capable of hope. Pilgrims still come, not in great throngs as they once did, but in gentle trickles. They arrive with backpacks and tired eyes, with questions too heavy to carry alone. Some speak many languages, some speak only with tears. They sit in the pews, they light candles, they touch the hem of her robe, and they leave something behind. Sometimes it is a token, a photo, a note, a ribbon. Sometimes it is a sorrow. Always, it is a part of themselves. They come seeking a miracle, and often, what they find instead is silence, stillness, a quiet so deep it reveals the voice they forgot they had. They are pilgrims of the heart, these strangers who walk our path, as are we all. I once believed that miracles were grand things, lightning from the sky, visions in the flame, the dead rising. I no longer believe that. Now, I believe that miracles are slow, that they take root like seeds in soil, needing darkness and time before they bloom. I have seen anger soften into forgiveness. I have seen pride melt into service. I have seen the lonely find communion, the shattered find purpose, the doubting find peace, not in an instant, but in a lifetime, and always, always, with her smile at the center. I sometimes wonder what she thinks of us, this virgin of ours. Does she smile still because we amuse her? Does she smile because she sees who we are becoming? Or perhaps she smiles because she knows what we do not, that even when we falter, even when we forget, we are never beyond grace. The children ask me why I still come every day. Aren't you tired, abuelo? They say. I smile and tell them that this place has held my heart for so long. I would not know what to do without it, but the truth is simpler. I come because something sacred waits here, not just in the statue, not just in the past, but in the people who keep returning, in the stories they carry, in the way they kneel, in the tears they shed, in the hope they dare. The miracle lives not in marble, but in movement, not in stone, but in spirit, not in one moment of divine interruption, but in 1,000 small acts of love repeated across generations. We are all pilgrims of the heart, seeking light, seeking peace, and sometimes, when we are lucky, we find it not in thunder or fire, but in the stillness of a smile that healed, a smile that remained, a smile that, even now, guides us home. My soul magnifies the Lord. Luke chapter 1 verse 46. In the end, it was not thunder or fire that changed us. It was not the earthquake, nor the ruin it left behind. It was not the scent of roses in the wind or the glow upon marble at midnight. It was a smile so small, so subtle, it might have gone unnoticed by the eyes, but not by the heart. It came to us in our darkest hour, not to erase the sorrow, but to sit beside it, not to undo our pain, but to transfigure it, and in that soft curve of stone lips, we found the courage to begin again. We built, we prayed, we forgave, we lived differently, not perfectly, but more gently. We remembered, we believed, and now, long after the dust has settled and new generations walk the path to the chapel, that smile remains, unchanged, unmoving, yet somehow, always speaking, a sign not of divine distance, but divine nearness, a whisper from heaven, a promise. Holy Mother, you who stood silent among ruin, who smiled when the world trembled, teach us to hold peace when the earth shakes beneath us. Help us find light in the ashes, hope in the silence, and God in the smallest of signs. Let your smile be the mirror in which we see the face of mercy. Amen.